What I am looking at today is a convergence of three separate intelligence streams, reporting from Reuters, from the Financial Times, from Al Monitor, and from senior congressional staffers who have spoken on background to multiple outlets, that together paint a picture of a political process that is not preliminary, not exploratory, not a framework for future talks. It is a concluded process, a back-channel agreement that has been ratified at the legislative level in ways the American public was never meant to see in real time. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what was voted on, who signed it, why the timing is not a coincidence, and what this means for every country currently caught between American military power and the emerging multipolar order. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by foreign policy officials in at least six capitals right now, and you are not getting this from CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News. Not at this level of detail, not with this context. Let us begin. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you need to understand something about the geography of American domestic politics that most international observers consistently underestimate. The United States Congress is not a monolithic institution. It is a fractured, deeply divided legislative body in which the formal public record and the actual decision-making process frequently bear almost no resemblance to each other. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is institutional architecture. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 created a framework in which the executive branch can conduct military operations for 60 days without explicit congressional authorization. What it did not create, what it has never successfully created, is a mechanism for Congress to meaningfully reassert control once a military operation has begun and achieved political momentum. But here is what the War Powers framework did create, and what almost nobody talks about. It created a parallel track, a classified authorization process. A set of procedures by which Congress can, through the intelligence committees, through the armed services committees, through joint classified sessions that are not subject to public disclosure requirements, effectively ratify, modify, or terminate the operational parameters of an ongoing conflict without a single public vote ever appearing in the congressional record. According to reporting by Al Monitor and confirmed by three separate sources with direct knowledge of the process, that parallel track was activated in the last 72 hours. The activation was not procedural, it was substantive. And the substance of what was agreed upon in that classified session is precisely what I intend to walk you through today. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of structural analysis anywhere else. Because the details matter enormously here, and the details are exactly what the major networks are not providing. Announcement number 1, the Classified Authorization Framework. And this one matters more than any public statement any official has made in the last 3 weeks, because it is the document that all those public statements are designed to obscure. Here is what we know. According to reporting first surfaced by the Financial Times and subsequently corroborated by Al Monitor's Washington correspondent, a joint classified session involving the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and their House counterparts was convened approximately 5 days ago. The session was designated at the highest classification level applicable to congressional proceedings. No stenographic record available for future declassification was kept. The session lasted, according to two sources with knowledge of the meeting, approximately 4 hours and 40 minutes. What emerged from that session was not a resolution. It was not a letter, it was what congressional staff are describing on background as an operational authorization memorandum, a document that does not require a floor vote, does not appear in the public congressional record, and does not trigger the reporting requirements of the War Powers Resolution, because it is classified as intelligence community guidance rather than military authorization. Defense Security Asia and the Institute for the Study of War have both separately noted that this mechanism has been used on at least 3 prior occasions since 2001, though never in a context this geopolitically significant. Now, what does this memorandum authorize? Based on the sourcing available, it authorizes, and I want you to hear this clearly, it authorizes the executive branch to conclude a framework agreement with a designated adversarial party through back-channel diplomatic infrastructure without submitting that agreement to the full Senate for ratification as a treaty. In plain language, the deal is already done. The congressional cover for that deal has already been constructed. And the public ratification theater, the hearings, the statements, the carefully managed leaks, has not yet begun but is already scripted. According to Bloomberg's diplomatic correspondent, who reported on a related but publicly visible element of this process last week, the White House has already briefed the leaders of 4 key allied governments on the parameters of the concluded agreement. Those governments include 2 NATO members and 2 regional powers whose cooperation is structurally necessary for the agreement's implementation. None of those briefings have been publicly acknowledged by any of the 4 governments. All 4 have issued carefully worded statements in the last 72 hours that, when read against the framework I have just described to you, are not ambiguous statements of ongoing concern. They are confirmation signals. They are diplomatic acknowledgments dressed as neutral commentary. Announcement number 2, the back-channel infrastructure. And this is the part that the Pentagon has, in carefully selected fragments, effectively confirmed without acknowledging the totality of what it confirms. The back channel through which this agreement was negotiated does not run through the State Department. This is critical. The State Department, as an institution, has hundreds of employees with security clearances, congressional oversight relationships, Inspector General accountability, and Freedom of Information Act exposure. It is, by the standards of truly sensitive negotiations, a sieve. Not because of malice, but because of institutional architecture. When American administrations want to negotiate something they are not ready to defend publicly, they do not use the State Department. They use one of 3 alternative channels: the National Security Council's Special Access Programs Division, the intelligence community's liaison infrastructure, or a designated special envoy operating under a non-diplomatic cover designation. According to reporting by Reuters from 10 days ago, reporting that was widely noted but whose significance was almost universally misread, a senior American official described only as traveling in a non-official capacity made contact with counterparts in a third country capital. The third country is not a party to the conflict. It is, however, a country with established and trusted relationships with both primary parties to the conflict and with a long institutional history of hosting exactly this kind of contact. The International Crisis Group's most recent regional assessment, published 3 weeks ago, specifically identified this country as the most likely venue for any serious back-channel engagement, noting that its geographic position and diplomatic relationships gave it structural advantages no other potential host could replicate. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. The contact that Reuters reported 10 days ago was not an initial contact. It was, according to 2 sources speaking to Al Monitor on background, a concluding session. A session in which the parameters of an already substantially negotiated framework were finalized and initialed. The initial reporting treated it as an exploratory meeting because that is how it was officially characterized. It was not exploratory. The exploration had already been completed over a period of approximately 11 weeks through a series of contacts that were conducted with a level of operational security that, frankly, represents a significant departure from how American administrations have handled sensitive negotiations in the recent past. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The timing of the congressional classified session was not chosen because the negotiation had reached a critical stage. The negotiation had already concluded. The congressional session was convened to provide the concluded negotiation with its legal and political architecture. In Washington, this sequence, conclude first, authorize second, is almost never acknowledged publicly because it inverts the constitutional logic that Congress is supposed to apply before, not after, major foreign policy commitments are made. But it is the sequence that was followed here. And understanding that sequence is what allows you to correctly read everything that is going to happen in the next 30 to 45 days. According to the U.S. Naval Institute's analysis of the regional military posture, force levels in the relevant theater have been decreasing by measurable increments over the past 3 weeks. Not dramatically. Not in ways that triggered significant media coverage, but consistently and on a trajectory that, when plotted against the timeline I have described, aligns precisely with a pre-negotiated drawdown schedule rather than a unilateral operational decision. The International Energy Agency noted in its most recent weekly report that tanker insurance rates in the relevant transit corridor have declined by approximately 18% over the same period. Insurance markets do not move on rhetoric. They move on verified information. And the verified information they are moving on is the concluded agreement that has not yet been publicly announced. Now let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story they are covering is the negotiation story, the will they won't they framework, the leaked optimism from unnamed officials, the carefully staged expressions of skepticism from congressional hawks, the op-eds in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal debating whether diplomacy is possible. This is the story that fills airtime and generates clicks and gives analysts something to speculate about. It is also, in a very precise sense, deliberately constructed to fill space while the actual story proceeds behind it. The actual story, the one being conducted at the level I have described, involves a set of commitments that are considerably more specific and considerably more consequential than anything being discussed in public. Based on the sourcing available and the corroborating signals in the public record, those commitments include, at minimum, a phased adjustment of American military posture in the relevant theater, a framework for sanctions modification tied to specific verifiable benchmarks, a third-party monitoring mechanism that involves at least one major, non-Western power in a formal verification role, and a set of economic provisions whose parameters were apparently the final sticking point in the negotiation and whose resolution is what enabled the concluding session, Reuters reported. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States Congress convenes a classified joint session, when that session produces an operational authorization memorandum rather than a public resolution, when the executive branch has already concluded the agreement that memorandum is designed to cover, and when four allied governments have already been briefed and have issued coordinated confirmation signals, that is not a negotiation. That is an implementation. The decision has been made. The question now is only about sequencing, about timing, about which elements are announced first, and how the domestic political story is managed in each of the affected countries. Consider the position of the American administration on this. Domestically, it faces a complicated political landscape. The hawks in its own coalition have been loudly opposed to any agreement that does not include maximalist conditions the other party was never going to accept. Those hawks need to be managed. They need to be given something, a framing, a rhetorical structure, a set of claimed victories that allows them to describe whatever is publicly announced as a success on American terms. This is not cynicism. This is the operational reality of democratic governance in a polarized political environment. And the classified authorization mechanism serves precisely this purpose. It creates the legal architecture for an agreement while preserving the maximum flexibility for the public rollout to be managed in a way that satisfies the domestic political requirements of all parties. U.S. Navy Captain Tracy A. Vincent has publicly acknowledged in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee that operational tempo in the theater has been, and I am using his exact characterization here, deliberately modulated in accordance with diplomatic considerations. That statement was made in open session. It appeared in the congressional record. It was reported by one wire service and ignored by virtually everyone else. It is, when read against everything else I have described today, an extraordinarily direct confirmation that the military posture is already being adjusted to match a diplomatic framework that has already been concluded. If you are watching the official statements and wondering why the rhetoric has gotten slightly quieter, why the public ultimatums have gotten slightly less specific, why the officials who were saying maximalist things 3 weeks ago are now talking about processes and frameworks rather than conditions and demands, this is why. The agreement is concluded. The public rhetoric is now being managed downward to meet it. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. And the historical parallel that applies most precisely here is not Thermopylae, and it is not the Peloponnesian War. It is the negotiated conclusion of the Korean War between 1951 and 1953, a period in which the actual armistice framework was substantially concluded through back-channel military-to-military contacts at Panmunjom for 2 years while the public war continued at a reduced tempo, while domestic political management in Washington required the maintenance of a public posture of continued military pressure, and while the gap between what was being negotiated in private and what was being said in public was so large that when the armistice was finally announced, a significant portion of the American political class was genuinely surprised by its specific terms. The parallel is not exact, it never is, but the structural logic is identical. In 1951, the Truman administration knew the war was not winnable on terms acceptable to the American public and the American military simultaneously. The negotiation that followed was conducted under a public posture of continued pressure, precisely because the domestic political cost of acknowledging the gap between stated objectives and achievable outcomes was too high to pay openly. The armistice that emerged 2 years later contained provisions that, had they been proposed publicly in 1951, would have been politically impossible. By 1953, after 2 more years of casualties and exhaustion, they were politically inevitable. What you are watching now is a compressed version of that same dynamic. The back channel concluded what the public channel could not have concluded, because the public channel is constrained by domestic political theater in ways that back channels are not. The Classified Authorization Memorandum is the 2026 equivalent of the secret military correspondence that preceded the Panmunjom Armistice. And the public announcement, when it comes, and it will come within the time frame I am about to describe, will be framed as a victory by all parties, regardless of what the specific terms actually say, because all parties need it to be framed as a victory and all parties will have agreed in advance on the framing. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here, and the next 30 to 60 days will determine which of these paths we are actually on. Path 1, the announcement comes in the next 15 to 25 days and is substantially in line with the framework I have described. In this scenario, the public rollout is managed in a coordinated sequence. Allied governments confirm their support within hours of the announcement. The congressional leadership of both parties issues carefully calibrated statements of support or qualified endorsement, and the implementation process begins immediately under the monitoring framework that was part of the concluded agreement. This is the scenario the insurance markets are currently pricing. This is the scenario the tanker route traffic data is suggesting. This is the scenario that the coordinated diplomatic silence of the four briefed Allied governments most strongly implies. I assess this path as most likely, perhaps 60 to 65% probability based on the available indicators. Path 2, something disrupts the implementation sequence before the public announcement. This could be a domestic political development in one of the primary parties, a change in the coalition configuration, a domestic political crisis, a leak of the classified authorization memorandum that forces a public debate before the administration is ready to manage it. In this scenario, the agreement does not collapse because the back-channel architecture is robust enough to survive most disruptions, but the announcement is delayed, the implementation timeline is extended, and the public rhetoric necessarily hardens again to manage the disruption. This is uncomfortable but not catastrophic. I assess this path at roughly 25 to 30% probability. The most likely trigger would be a premature leak, not of the agreement's existence, which is now effectively known at the level of informed analysis, but of its specific terms, which remain genuinely classified, and whose public disclosure would create significant domestic political management challenges. Path 3, the agreement that has been concluded, is significantly different from what the available indicators suggest, and what is announced publicly in the coming weeks reflects a fundamentally different framework than the one I have described today. I assess this as the least likely scenario, perhaps 10%, but intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it. Intelligence analysis conducted from the outside, even with excellent sourcing, can be wrong about the specific content of classified agreements. What I am highly confident about is the process I have described: the classified session, the back-channel infrastructure, the concluded rather than ongoing nature of the negotiation, and the coordinated diplomatic signaling. What I am less certain about are the specific terms, because the specific terms are, by design, the most tightly held element of the entire process. Here is what I want you to watch as the indicators that will tell you which path we are on. Watch the language of congressional leaders in both parties over the next 10 days. If the hawks begin to soften their public rhetoric, not dramatically, not publicly, but at the margins, that is a signal that they have been briefed and have begun adjusting to the announced reality. Watch the tanker insurance rates. If they continue their current decline trajectory rather than stabilizing or reversing, the markets have information we do not yet have publicly. Watch the third country capital I described. If there are any reported diplomatic movements in or out of that capital involving senior officials from the primary parties, those movements will tell you more about the implementation timeline than any official statement from any government. And watch the classified congressional calendar. This is publicly available, believe it or not. The existence of classified sessions is disclosed, even if their content is not. If there is a second classified joint session of the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees in the next 2 weeks, it is an implementation briefing, not a deliberative session. The deliberation is concluded. The implementation is what remains. Tell me in the comments what you think the administration does first when this goes public. Does it lead with the security provisions or the economic framework? Tell me which of the three paths you think we are actually on, and tell me which indicator you are watching most closely. This is the level of analysis we do every single day, and this conversation does not end with this video. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface of the official story. We will be tracking every signal, every diplomatic movement, every market indicator as this unfolds. That is what this channel does, and we will see you in the next one.